Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative's fourth Learning Laboratory. We're excited to be joined by participants from across more than 45 countries, representing over 260 organizations. The Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, or DAC, as we call it, intends to work globally on Alzheimer's disease, and today's audience reflects the ambition and the reach. So thank you for being here. My name is Drew Holzhoffel. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. We're a Swiss-based foundation and a US 501c3 built by a partnership between the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's Disease and the World Economic Forum. The purpose of today's Learning Laboratory is to share with you what we have learned as we have funded healthcare systems around the world to deploy innovative technologies in enabling early detection of cognitive impairment. The Learning Lab model is based on the old medical model of teaching. See one, do one, teach one. And we hope that by you seeing what we are doing today, you will be able to work with your organization within your geography and with your key stakeholders to improve detection. The timing of today's conversation is important. For the first time in decades, there's renewed hope and optimism in the field, with expected regulatory approval of new treatments on the horizon and other positive data emerging. But there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that these treatments make it to patients, including preparing healthcare systems to use new innovations to detect, diagnose, and treat those living with Alzheimer's disease or at the risk for developing it. We started to explore this topic in our last Learning Lab held in December, and three key topics really emerged. One is you have to engage and empower primary care. Two is you have to extend the front lines beyond primary care into the communities and into pharmacies. And then the third is you have to identify, enable, and share solutions using a common global framework, yet be able to adapt it to local capabilities and contexts. We'll build on these themes today through a series of conversations with our DAC partners who are truly global leaders in spurring new means of detection. You'll hear from representatives from Gates Ventures and Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, Global Digital Cognitive Assessment and blood-based biomarkers companies, and policy experts who will share their views on what it takes to expand the policy landscape for early and timely detection. This is meant to be an interactive dialogue, so please use the Q&A function to pose questions for our speakers. And now I'd like to turn it over to Phyllis Farrell, who is our co-director of the DAC Healthcare System Preparedness Program, for our first session of today's meeting. Phyllis, over to you.
Hi, Drew. Thanks for getting us kicked off. It's such a pleasure to be with everybody today. So excited about everybody that we've got online. So thank you for joining. I'm especially pleased to start off with our fireside chat with Christina Malzbender from Gates Ventures and Mark Roithmeyer from ADDF. And so I'm going to ask both of them to go ahead and come on camera. And what we're going to talk a little bit about today is the situation for diagnostics in Alzheimer's disease. As we know, we have been researching therapeutics now for many decades, finally starting to have some success. But as I began working with Gates Ventures and ADDF, 6, 7 years ago, we started talking about the fact that if we didn't have diagnostics that helped us identify cognitive impairment early, and those that then could identify accurate pathology, and that if patients weren't actually getting access to those diagnostics, they'd never get to the innovative therapeutics. And we all want to make sure that the right patient is able to get the right treatment at the right time. So we call this the translational gap in pharma. But in diagnostics, there's two translational gaps. There's one that's getting to the regulatory pathway, through the regulatory pathway and getting that first approval. And then there's the other that's actually getting through all of the heroics that it takes to actually get the innovation into clinical workflows. And so Gates Ventures and ADDF have actually joined forces and created a very unique model called the Diagnostics Accelerator. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. But I'm going to start with introductions, and I'm going to let you all introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organization. Both of these organizations have been pretty relentless in their commitment and tenacity with funding innovation in this space. So Christina, can I start with you, please?
Sure, I would be happy to. So my name is Christina Malsbender. I'm an associate director on the Health and Life Sciences team at Gates Ventures. And just for some context, Gates Ventures is the private office of Mr. Bill Gates. And our Health and Life Sciences team in particular is focused on advancing scientific thinking and catalyzing change by deploying creative solutions to pressing healthcare challenges and global health challenges. One of these priority areas is Alzheimer's disease. And back in 2017, Bill announced he was committing resources to tackling AD through various investments and partnerships across a range of areas. And so I've been at Gates Ventures for the last 4 years, and in that time have primarily focused on biomarkers and diagnostics, as well as enabling clinical trials. And so really glad to be here with my colleague and friend, Mark, as well as you, Phyllis.
Great. And we love having you here. Mark, can you introduce yourself and your organization for us?
Sure. Mark Reithmer, CEO of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. We've been around for 25 years, founded by the Lauder family in honor of Estee Lauder, by our two sons, Leonard and Ronald, and of course, somebody who I think many of you know, Dr. Howard Phillott. We do three things. We investigate biomarkers/diagnostics, prevention and treatments. We are a venture philanthropy, which means we only fund science. We do not make grants. We make contracts with academics and with biotech so that if they see any deal flow from the investment, we get a percentage of that back. That money goes directly back into the science. We currently carry a portfolio of over 35 clinical trials, about 55 million of active investment. Additionally, we have the $100 million diagnostic accelerator. As you said, Phyllis, we'll hear more about that today. On the diagnostic side, just a bit of a claim to fame, two things. The Amyvid PET scan, which is owned by Lilly these days, was something that ADDF originally invested in out of a scientist at the University of Pennsylvania and helped spin the company out. And also more recently, 2 or 3 summers ago, the C2N blood test that came out of WashU in St. Louis. So privileged to be here. Absolute privilege to be on the panel with you, Phyllis, who we all see as kind of the czar of Alzheimer's, and also with Christina, who we could not have a better partner than our friends at Gates Ventures. So thrilled to be here and thrilled to be with the audience today.
Thanks, Mark. Not sure about the czarship there, but I will definitely take the fact that we've got about 15 minutes here together, which is never enough time. But, you know, the three of us actually spend a lot of time working behind the scenes. So one of my goals today is to let the group that's online here get to see a little bit, peek behind the curtain as to some of the conversations that we have, how this all got started, why is it important? And so we let in with that already. But Mark, I'm going to just start with you. Can you give us a little bit of the history of the Diagnostics Accelerator, how it came to be, why you think it's so important, and why ADDF decided to work with Gates Ventures on this initiative?
Truth be told, why it came to be is because Phyllis had been speaking with the folks at Gates Ventures, and they had a real interest in biomarkers and diagnostics. And she said, well, you're going to meet Howard Phillott in the ADDF. I suspect the rest is history, but I will say it was about a 9-month negotiation back and forth, where originally Bill Gates put up 10 million, Leonard Lauder put up 10 million of what is now 100 million. We have additional funders that are involved with that. Real simple, to be about 3 things. Could we bring peripheral blood diagnostics to market? Could we bring optical? And can we bring digital? And deeper dives on that, Christina can get all into, but that's where it all started. We're 4 years into it, 2 $50 million tranches. We have some leading companies for validation, and we still have a lot more in the proof and concept phase.
Great, thank you. It's always fun to play a little Match.com role in this space, especially when you see the magic that come from it, which you guys have absolutely created. One of the reasons that DAC is so excited about the Diagnostics Accelerator is you all actually fund a lot of the interventions that are now clinically ready that we want to put into these implementation studies. So Christina, I know you work really closely with the Diagnostics Accelerator team. So tell us a little bit about the role and vision that you all had for the accelerator and how it's evolved over time.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to look back on now, 4 years later. The vision at the time when we kicked off was to, as Mark said, to fund the development of these cutting edge diagnostics and biomarkers, but then also ensure that we can bring these tools to patients and clinicians at a global scale. And so I think at the time, 4 years ago, we expected a blood test for amyloid to be our biggest investment and the most likely to come to fruition earliest. And so for those of you that have been following the field probably know, blood tests for amyloid have proved to be a bit more challenging than we expected at the time for a number of reasons. And so I think now we've seen an explosion of interest in the field in both amyloid, but including other biomarkers like tau as well for blood tests. And so kind of looking to those as perhaps the ones that will be most successful at scale. So I think we're at this really exciting point in the field where we have a few different blood tests for AD on the market, but many more on the horizon. And so all of these tools combined have a lot of potential to help clinicians identify the disease earlier, offer the chance to intervene, to prevent or delay progression. And so I think what we expected 4 years ago has really, I don't think we would have foreseen where we are today. And it's really exciting to see just the vast number of different biomarkers that are in development, both funded by the DXA and elsewhere.
Yeah, one of the best things about being in the Alzheimer's disease field is we tend to not really care who takes credit. If the biomarker comes from someplace else, that's worthy of success. And so you focus specifically there on blood biomarkers. We also have been studying the digital cognitive assessments. I know that the Diagnostics Accelerator has been thinking about that as well. So in the DAC framework, we've actually split the kind of diagnosis flow into 2 steps. The first being the early detection of cognitive impairment, which is where we have the opportunity to use cognitive assessments, whether those be pen and paper or potentially to use technology to help enable those in a higher quality and more efficient way. You'll hear a little bit more about that later in the panel. And then also the blood test. So the next set of programs are looking at blood tests and CSF for that matter. So it's basically the step of early detection of cognitive impairment and then the second step of accurate diagnosis of that pathology. So I don't know, Mark or Christina, if one of you want to pick up this idea of digital, I know speech, voice, some of these things have been interesting to the ADDF and DXA. One of you want to jump in a little bit on how you guys are thinking about technology and how it enables diagnosis?
Yeah, let me just do a sentence and then Christina, I'll give it to you. It's not only digital, it's also optical. We're finding a lot of interest and early success in that. And of course, on the digital, there's Altoida, who's been awarded the Food and Drug Administration breakthrough. But Christina, I'll let you pick up all of that detail because that's where you spend your days, mornings and nights.
I'm glad you brought up eye too. I mean, there's this comment that the eye is the window to the brain, and we do actually have one of your companies, one of your portfolio companies, ReadySpec, is one of the DAC programs that's running right now. So I'm glad you brought that up. Christina, what are your thoughts on this idea of early detection and where the DXA fits in?
I think your comment made me think of, I think the framework in my head is kind of a toolbox of different measures that we hopefully will have available within a few years of the digital cognitive assessments, other digital tools, ocular tests, and blood tests, which kind of together can give you different contexts of use, different applications for these biomarkers, whether it's activating patients to think about their brain health or early detection or monitoring or some sort of stratification. So I think the combined power of all of these tools is really what's exciting to me on the horizon.
Yeah, I think this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all test, we just need the diagnostic, is one that we have to put to rest because there's just too many different things that have to happen around the use cases. And so I think this idea of, boy, there's several out there and a system. In fact, we found with our DAC systems, they like to be able to choose, whether that between diagnostic digital cognitive assessment tools or whether that be between different types of pathology tools, having choice is good. So we have a question in the in the chat. And I should go ahead and mention to everyone, as I'm the first speaker, put your questions here and the moderators will follow. So I'm going to open this one up. I've got a few more in my hip pocket, but usually we have a pretty dynamic audience. So the question is, how would you see emerging neurotechnologies applied to diagnostics? I'm guessing this might be in the space of EEG and some of the other things that we've seen come up. And I don't know if you guys have looked at EEG at all. We had some submissions for the grant program there. Those technologies weren't clinically ready, so they weren't able to be put into one of the implementation science programs. But have you all looked at those technologies at all?
Yeah, we have. We've funded one group out of ETH Zurich that's developing an in-ear EEG device. So I think that what we've been looking for there in that space is something that's perhaps less cumbersome and invasive and a bit more, yeah, I don't know what the word is, but
passive data collection.
Exactly. Yeah. So definitely an exciting field that we've made one investment so far, but I think we'd look to make more.
Yeah, this idea of passive data collection where, we all walk around with our, our wearables, can that data be collected? Mark, any thoughts on the vision of Diagnostics Accelerator and where you guys see this going? I mean, I know there was so much excitement around blood, but you've just, expanded significantly. So how big will you guys, how broad will you guys look at the field?
If you don't mind, let me turn this a slightly different way, because I think it would be remiss with.
I told people they were going to see behind the curtain of how this dynamic.
Right. Particularly with the audience we have on today, which I just applaud DAC and Us Against Alzheimer's, because everybody who's on here saying, we deliver the science, you deliver it to people who can benefit, and so we need you, which is fabulous. Phyllis, I'm going to go back to almost a year ago. We were in Boston. It was a CTAD meeting. We were meeting about diagnostics, and you stood up at the end and you gave a fiery speech. And your fiery speech was around personally in your own life, how you've been affected by Alzheimer's. And everybody's waiting for the perfect test and the perfect solution. And meanwhile, with all of our loved ones are around us, and couldn't we just start moving faster? And the reason I bring that up, I remember at the end of that diagnostics part of a CTAD, there was this notion that came from the audience that said, as these new drugs start coming through, the diagnostics are going to get pulled through, because it's going to be important of who doesn't get this specific drug, right? So that the drugs could be reimbursed. And I bring that up because just 2 weeks ago, I was up at Bio in Boston. And the new CEO of Biogen got all these questions about the ASI Biogen drug. Is it going to get approved? How is it going to get approved? Is it going to get reimbursed? Oh my gosh, it's an infusion. How are you going to deliver that? And the new CEO said this, all I know is the system is going to have to take care of this. And what did he mean by that? And you look at the ASI Biogen drug, and you look at the Lilly drug, and we all say it's an exciting time. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal had an article essentially saying both these drugs are getting approved. So everybody's going to have to start dealing with this. And it's interesting to me, Phyllis, that the Lilly drug is coming out with a companion diagnostic. And I would say Lilly's a really smart company. They want to make sure the frontline docs know who does not get this drug, right? And I say all this because I believe what's happening here, and what reminded me of it when you said the wearable, public demand. At the ADDF with our donors a year ago, it used to be, would you want to know? Why would you want to know? In a year, we no longer get that question. People want to know. And we were at the World Dementia Council in London earlier this year. And I think it's a British survey that was done, and our friends from the UK know this way better than I do, but I think it was, they surveyed the British population. 92% of the public said they would want to know in advance if they were going to have cognitive decline. Why do I bring that up? People are already using the wearable devices to figure out what their cognition is. How many people know folks who track their sleep? What's the number one reason they track their sleep? It's around cognition. So I guess I'm here to say in the macro environment, and there's going to be a lot of gnashing of teeth at what is perfect to get these diagnostics across the finish line. I believe we're going to be 2 to 3 years from now, and we're going to be pulling these through, right? Because the public demand is, wait a minute, there is something that can have a modest benefit to me. I want to know, how do I get that? If you're not telling me, I'm going to go find out myself, and they can. So just a thought as we open up the day today.
Yeah, well, my takeaway is what I'm hearing you say is Diagnostic Accelerator doesn't really have a limitation when it comes to mode. That if that in a multimodal way, if there's a technology that can help accelerate this field, you guys will consider it, which I think is fantastic.
We're agnostic.
I'm glad you brought up this idea of the innovations coming in therapeutics, because another benefit, I think, of splitting the early detection of cognitive impairment from the accurate diagnosis, and we saw this in our programs that are ongoing. People who've been following the Learning Labs have heard from the flagship sites. In the high resource countries, there's really a drive to have both of those steps, the early detection and the accurate diagnosis, for exactly the reason you say. We want to make sure only people that are going to benefit from the drugs get them. I don't think that's smart. Well, maybe it's smart, but I think that's also ethical, right? We need to make sure that the therapies are getting to people who actually have the disease that we're trying to treat. And so I think that's right. But what's interesting, in the low and middle income countries, there's been a huge adoption of this early detection of cognitive impairment, even though they aren't facing an immediate therapy on the horizon. I think a lot of that has to do with this knowledge of putting the support system around a family, which is the experience I had. How do you make sure that you know what's going on? How do you make sure that that family, that health system can actually put their arms around a family that's dealing with this, because you're going to prevent downstream costs when you do that. And so I think we're really excited about the pickup in these low and middle income countries of some of these digital cognitive assessments. So I'm going to give you guys a closing question. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So if you've submitted one, I'm going to work throughout the process to make sure that we can get these answered for you. So keep following your question online. But let me kind of give you, and I didn't prep you guys on this, so this would be fun. But Christina, I'm going to start with you. You've been in the field now for a little while, but you've got a lot of heart for this. What gives you hope? What makes you excited about being in this space? And why do you get up? You know, you're very early this morning on the Pacific time zone. So what gives you hope and excitement for working in this space?
Yeah, I think I would echo some of the comments that you made about a year ago at CTAB that Mark referenced of having my family members, seeing what they dealt with and trying to get a diagnosis, and not having treatments available once they had that diagnosis, and having gone through that a number of years ago, but then now seeing all of the progress that's been made in the field, both in terms of biomarkers and diagnostics, as well as therapeutics. I think we're on a really exciting horizon where I think we're approaching the validation and the approval of all of these technologies and tools. And so the next step is really like coming out of the ivory tower and figuring out, how do we use them in the real world? How do we get them to patients and families and caregivers to truly make an impact on their lives?
I love it. Yeah, the innovation won't matter if we leave it in a research setting. Mark, how about you? What makes you excited about being in this space? Besides the fact that you get to spend time with me and Christina, of course.
Touche. Yeah, I'll tell you, you're going to find this as a strange answer. It's what makes me nuts. We're seeing the first cracks in the wall, right, with these amyloid drugs or anti-amyloid drugs that are coming. But the big headline is what comes behind that. It's prevention. And talk about low and middle income countries. We can learn a lot from them about prevention also. They're taking basic steps, right, to do this. So it's the prevention and it's the combined therapies. What's so exciting is what's going on in things like inflammation and vascular and kinetics and mitochondrial. And what gets me excited and gets me nuts is getting pharma, VCs, even the government to understand that this is a complex disorder. So let's embrace the complexity and bring in this kind of multifactorial approach. The great news is there's this huge developing bench on that side. So it gets me excited because I know even just from the science perspective, there's so much more to do, but it is literally right out in front of us. It's not like this is 10 years from now. This is in the next 2 to 5 years. I have great hopes at CTAD. You're going to see much more of this biology of aging approach, and at ADPD next year also. The science community saying, hey, great on these 2 drugs, first crack in the wall, but the real answer is bigger. And the good news is there's a lot of research that's close here.
Well, I love that you gave us the call to action. You know, one of the reasons we do these learning labs is because it's a way for folks who aren't insiders in DAC to get connected, but also to come join the party. You know, there's space here. And I think you hit all of the this public, private, government roles here to play. So thanks for the call to action, welcoming everybody in, which we want to do, and most importantly, a real sense of urgency. These are progressive neurodegenerative diseases. People don't have time to wait. So let's move with what we've got, and then let's make it better. I love the message. So thanks to both of you for joining. We're so thankful as a field of the role that you play, both together and individually as funders and just in general cheerleaders of the science getting to the patient. So thank you for that. I'm going to introduce my counterpart and co-director, Tim McLeod, who will moderate the next panel discussion with actually 4 of our DAC strategic partners who have been providing their technologies in kind and are working directly with healthcare systems around the world to implement these technologies and make sure that we can improve the early detection of cognitive impairment. So Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Phyllis. So the topic of the panel is on leveraging innovative technologies for timely detection across geographies. And so we're going to talk about specifically digital cognitive assessments and blood-based biomarkers. And so, as Phyllis mentioned, our panelists this morning join us from companies who have products in those spaces. And they have worked really hard over the last couple of years to support us in our programs to really implement these tools in real-world health settings globally. So I'm going to give you a bit of background context on the programs. I'm going to then turn it over to my panelists to introduce themselves and tell you about their tools. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time really sharing what we've learned about the adoption of these tools in health systems globally, you know, what helps, what gets in the way, and what opportunities are in the future. So this is our system preparedness framework. We published it last year in Alzheimer's and dementia. I don't have time to go too deep into it this morning. The place that we started in thinking about system preparedness was in screening and early detection. And so as we talked about with in Phyllis's panel, screening and early detection is really important for a number of reasons, whether it be risk reduction or access to novel treatments. And so when we approached our programs, we decided to do a flagship program that ran a fairly common model, as well as a grant program that allowed health systems around the world to tell us what they thought would be impactful in their jurisdiction. So the goal of the studies was really to increase rates of cognitive assessment in primary or non-specialist care globally. On the next slide, you'll see the broad geographic footprint of those programs. So the flagship programs that use common tools were in Brazil, Jamaica, Japan, Mexico, Scotland, and the United States, while the grants were in Armenia, Brunei, Canada, Cuba, Germany, Japan, Kenya, and the US. And so to go a little deeper and give you a little bit of context of how our panelists and their companies supported the program, on the next slide, you will see a schematic overview of the study. So for the flagship program, we used primary care or non-specialist care settings. We used routine visits with a primary care provider to do a number of things to improve rates of cognitive assessment. So we use digital cognitive assessments in care. Sites would do tests for reversible causes according to local clinical standards. And we were also able to leverage a blood-based biomarker in the majority of sites as well. So against this backdrop, I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists. they have done such an amazing job in supporting both us and our sites over the last couple of years, and have learned a ton of really interesting stuff moving into real world health systems and seeing what went well and where there's opportunities for improvement. So without further ado, Tom, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So Tom O'Neill, the CEO of CogniView. We're a company based out of Rochester, New York, with about 70 employees. We were the first FDA-cleared computerized test of cognition. So we went through that de novo process to kind of break ground. The company focuses really on three things: our clinical validation. So we've got dozens of studies and thousands of patients through studies to validate our technology. We've spent time refining our technology further, and then really focused our time on providers. So those providers could be everybody from non-MDs to other clinicians, pharmacies, optometrists, audiologists, and others. I think what's interesting about our technology, it is a device. So it's different than just a wearable. Our technology not only removes as much of that variability, human error, and bias that you find in traditional paper and pencil, but also adapts throughout the entire assessment to that person's abilities. So it really becomes a personalized test or assessment for that individual. We have two. We have a CogniView Thrive, which is our 5-minute screening, and CogniView Clarity, which is our 10-minute more of an MD assessment.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Sure. Yep.
And Brad, we're very appreciative of you joining us. I know it's late in the evening in Australia, so I'll turn it to you to introduce yourself and your product.
Thank you, Tim. So Brad O'Connor, I'm the Chief Executive of Cogstate. Cogstate began as a company over 20 years ago now, really looking at ways that we could bring technology to brain health assessment. Predominantly over that 20 years, we've worked in clinical drug trials. So we've worked with a lot of the pharmaceutical companies in terms of using our technology as an endpoint in those studies and assessing the effectiveness of those drugs. We're really focused on validating our technology, more than 600 peer-reviewed publications now, supporting the sensitivity, the specificity, and the effectiveness of our technology in terms of measurement of cognition and correlation with biomarkers and things like that. The original sort of goal of Cogstate, I suppose, or the original investment thesis was around this idea that, that one day, back in the late 90s, one day soon, Alzheimer's disease therapies would be on market and doctors would need technology to help them, measure cognition. And we find ourselves some 23, 24 years later, confronting that reality. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. And I just really want to thank everyone involved in DAC for the opportunities we've had to run these studies, which have been, I think, really insightful.
Hey, thanks, Brad. And Joel, maybe over to you.
Great, thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really an honor to be able to address such a global audience and the incredible interest to figure out better ways to identify individuals at risk and then ultimately enable them access to emerging therapies. So my name is Joel Bronstein. I'm a physician, actually cardiologist by professional training. I've been involved with neurosciences for longer than I have been involved with cardiovascular sciences. So I helped C2N Diagnostics get off the ground in 2007. We are a technology spinout from the WashU School of Medicine with David Holtzman and Randy Bateman, who are two well-known professors who have really dedicated their entire careers to understanding ways to better diagnose and ultimately treat Alzheimer's disease. And so C2N Diagnostics runs a specialty CAP-CLIA lab in St. Louis. We have approximately 60 people on staff with a number of other individuals that are key supporters, both within and outside the US. We offer our initial test, which was part of the flagship, was the Preparedness AD test. And we use high resolution mass spectrometry to precisely quantitate two important markers that are involved with disease pathogenesis of Alzheimer's. And that includes amyloid beta 42/40, which is expressed as a ratio, and also apolipoprotein E, which is a strong genetic marker, of course. We actually measure the protein forms, which is the equivalent of measuring the genotype. And so what we do is we combine the ApoE measurements with the A-beta 4240 measures with age into a proprietary algorithm that then identifies the likelihood of amyloid pathology using, at this point, we've now studied tens of thousands of individuals in a whole variety of clinical studies with both amyloid PET as a reference standard as well as cerebrospinal fluid. We do have a breakthrough device designation. We're about to introduce our next generation test, which is not only measuring amyloid beta 4240, but also phosphorylated tau 217 over what we call a non-phosphorylated 217 tau fragment. And that ratio of the p-tau 217 ratio that we refer to is actually really important in the context of comorbidities, because we know that in many individuals who are older, that they have mixed disease, they have renal impairment, they can have other cardiovascular comorbidities, and that can alter the interpretation of these blood tests. And so using the ratio measurements that we provide, we believe we're able to get over many of those issues. And it results in a very robust measurement. We see ourselves as ultimately being comparable to PET and CSF, and we have a lot of emerging data. So I'll stop there, but it's great to be here, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Joel. And finally, David, over to you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is David Bates. I'm the CEO of Linus Health. So Linus Health, briefly, is an enterprise-grade digital platform for neuropsychological assessments. And basically what we do is we leverage signal processing and artificial intelligence to transform the sensor array in a consumer device like an iPad into a state-of-the-art medical device capable of assessing brain function with very high sensitivity and specificity. So we are able to pick up cognition, signs of cognition, as well as any kind of motor dysfunction, even some neuropsychological distress in a very short period of time. And so we have two platforms, one that is in the clinic, and that is a very short assessment that gets a good read on brain health and brain function, and is tied to clinical decision support and has differential diagnosis capabilities. So really, primary care can identify what's going on with an individual in a very short period of time and know what to do about it, connect them to specialty or what have you. And then we also have another platform for clinical research, which you can assemble batteries of these digital cognitive assessments, questionnaires, all kinds of things, and run hybrid trials. And it's so good to be with everyone this morning, and I look forward to the discussion ahead.
Great. So I know you have a ton of overlapping experience as a group in trying to take your products into, vastly different geographic regions with different levels of resources and different incentives and policy backdrops. So one of the things Phil has touched on, as well as Mark and Christina, is this idea of a second translational gap. So, on the one hand, showing the efficacy and effectiveness of a diagnostic, and on the other, getting to real world use and the empirical evidence we have that in the middle, there tends to be a big lag between those two things that really has to do with operational and policy issues as well as clinical medicine. So I would love to just start with the question of what were the big challenges and opportunities you pulled out of the various programs as you integrated your product into really diverse geographic settings. So David, why don't we start with you? I know this will turn into a conversation pretty quickly, but why don't you get us started?
Sure. So one of the things that was surprising to us, or one of the challenges, I should say, was the acceptance of the results. Because the assessment we use in primary care has a greater sensitivity and specificity than a lot of the paper-based gold standards. Physicians were seeing people they knew for years light up. And they were like, no, this can't be true. I know this person. I've known them for a decade. And then you have to go through the whole thing, have the specialist come in, and then the primary care physician learns, indeed, this person is experiencing cognitive impairment, very early stages of MCI, which could be caused by Alzheimer's disease. And so getting kind of the education piece and really walking people through what, if artificial intelligence, what's in the black box, how to understand it. That was one of those things that surprised. It was a challenge, but it was overcome once things are explained, once people see the proof, once they see the evidence, they get increasingly comfortable and they're able to carry, continue on and actually feel encouraged to do so. But it is a consistent thing we come across with every deployment. So now we tell them in advance, you're going to see this. Don't be alarmed. We'll walk through it together, and that seems to be doing pretty well.
Great. And Brad, I know you, in the course of your programs, also thought a lot about education and physician behavior. So curious what the big sort of challenges and opportunities you pulled out of the studies. Oh, Brad, you're just on mute.
Sorry about that. It was really interesting, Tim. I think operating in a couple of different countries, we saw the differences between those. So we worked in the United States, Japan, and Brazil, and I think the difference between particularly the United States and Brazil was really striking, where we had a lot of real community engagement in the operation, the trials we did in Brazil. And that connection to community was a really important aspect in terms of driving adoption, increasing understanding, increasing awareness, both in the patient population and the physician population. And I think the biggest takeaway for us was probably within that setting, at least, having support of local government, having people on the ground who are connected to the community was a really important factor in terms of driving adoption. And then I think the other thing that we learned was that the ability to work within the workflow of the physician's office, and the fact that that's different in different countries, or even different in different settings within the same country, was really important. And we found that there was an eagerness for self-assessment and to give, to provide agency to the patients, to be able to conduct assessments on their own, through smartphone type assessments and those, that type of assessment, and then to come back to the physician and talk about those results. So, different findings in different settings, and I think, that in and of itself, of being able to provide the right tool for the right setting, was a really clear takeaway for us.
Right. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's very interesting to see you get very different policy environments as well as different health systems at the local level, and sort of the integration between the policy incentives and local decision makers and the physicians really starts to matter.
100%.
I'm curious on the blood side, same question for you. What were the sort of big takeaways in terms of opportunities and challenges in the really diverse settings that the PRECIPI-AD test was in?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Well, I think we were eager to be able to support the project. We were delighted to have the opportunity, and we said, sure, this will be great. We'll introduce the test across 6 countries and 7 healthcare systems, and it'll be so easy to implement a simple blood test. The reality is that it's not that simple. There's operational and logistical challenges. I think that on the surface, I think there was pretty uniform understanding from the clinicians who came to learn about the test and then understand how to interpret it. So I actually don't think the interpretation and actually the use of the test was so difficult, but operationally, a lot of policies and procedures had to be implemented. Now, we had a special situation because currently C2N does all of its testing in St. Louis. So that means samples have to be collected locally and then they're sent, they're shipped ultimately to the C2N lab. And our C2N lab has been really designed and optimized for productivity. We can, at this point, run over close to 500,000 analyte samples a year if necessary. And I think that the scalability is not so much the issue within a single facility, but when you start thinking about a global footprint, you do need to start thinking about local capabilities because that shipping and logistics does become an important part. And actually toward that goal, C2N has announced partnerships with both Brazil, which was one of the flagship sites, and also in Australia, working with two very large, well-established laboratories there that will be offering the test locally. And so this is a work in progress, but I think we found that there was a lot of enthusiasm, fairly easy to train and interpret. Logistically, operationally, some issues in trying to really work through some of the import-export issues and then the actual procedure of implementing it into the standard practice of each of the sites.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a question in the chat around, the potential of blood-based biomarkers to be accurate, cost-effective, and easily accessible, and sort of what comes next. I think you touched on two really good themes. One is, the challenge of disclosure broadly and at scale, and the other is just, logistics and workflow. And I know in the context of these studies, there was interesting things where primary care wasn't used to using the types of pipettes and tubes that we needed. And so things that seem like a small deal before you implement in the context of, national health systems where you need to get procurement involved, you can get a lot of complexity. So I think there's some really good themes about what comes next. Tom, maybe could you tell us about something that really surprised you during the planning and implementation of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we did our program in independent pharmacy. And what people might be surprised to know is because I think everybody thinks of Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, Walmart, Boots, right? If they think of pharmacy, but there are 20,000 independent pharmacies just in the US alone. And many of those are in rural areas. I think as I agree with Brad, David, and Joel, all the challenges that you have within, whether it's doing the blood analysis and work or working within primary care, but take that a step back into pharmacy. These are not clinicians that normally do cognitive testing. So getting them to understand how to implement a new clinical service within their pharmacy in a way that does not put them in a difficult position where they feel like they have to be a neurologist, I think was one of the aha moments for us, and making sure that we were training them to be prepared to control what they can control, right? You influence what you can influence. So that could be their diabetes program, their smoking cessation program, their polypharmacy with their patients. But also, I think the biggest takeaway is making sure that we're making that connection between the pharmacy and the primary care doctor. So, Tim, we have to broaden the screening class. The screening class cannot just sit with the primary care docs. We just don't have enough. And it certainly isn't going to sit with neurology because there's even fewer of those. So we got to broaden the screening class into this pharmacy and other clinicians like audiologists, optometrists, pharmacists. But that was one of the big ahas. Make sure that referral network is built there so that if they don't score well, then what? If that then what is outside their purview of their capabilities.
Great. I'm curious for the rest of the group, any sort of big surprises for you in the implementation of the programs?
some surprises in the implementation of the program for me was just that there's still some resistance out there, a lot actually, about just an understanding. And of course, doctors are trained to be skeptical about new things, as they should be. But these are very, very validated assessments built on, ours is built on over 100 years of neuropsychological research. I mean, it's very well published. But there is that resistance, the skepticism, what can be done about it. And then, so that's on the doctor's side. It's not all of, certainly not all of, but it's a good proportion. I think that's lightening up with the emerging therapies. But there's also some stigma with the patients, some fear of finding out something, even though Alzheimer's is the #1 fear, according to surveys, both published and ones we've conducted. It's the #1 fear, but it is seldom talked about. And so it's, how do we remove that fear? How do we educate? How do we really close the knowledge gaps on both the primary care providers about the plethora of things that can be done, all the published research from lifestyle modification to the emerging therapies and everything in between, and to the patients that, look, there are things you can do. The earlier you know something, the earlier you know there's a risk, the more benefit you could have, the higher quality of life you could have. Even if you do have MCI, you could live a high quality life. So I think there is a real need for education in both directions.
Yeah, I'd second that. I think the education piece and just the awareness of brain health, of healthy aging, and all the issues that David discussed, I think is I would just echo those remarks.
Yeah, I think Brad and David, I think one of the other things, Tim, is it's not just we think of the patient or the person that's concerned for themselves, but it's also the caregivers, and we call them the worried well. So they've seen mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle with dementia, Alzheimer's. They're coming into the pharmacy. They're coming into the primary care office. They're looking to try to understand, I've seen it in my family. Am I going to have it? So I think I couldn't agree more about education, but just access to the screening and testing.
And Tom, I'm curious, there's a question in the chat around, as we emerge, one of the key things here is to have capacity. Primary care physicians aren't going to be able to do this alone. We're going to need to shift both in clinic, but also look at other front doors. And, you talked about pharmacies. Do you have a sense, did training or education look any different in a pharmacy context for pharmacists as providers than in primary care?
Yeah, it's interesting. It does look different, and it looks different in pharmacy because they're not. This is not a traditional clinical service that they provide or haven't in the past. So I think really helping them understand, because if they're not confident to provide the test and have a conversation after it, then they'll just avoid it. They just won't do it. Where an MD does have that confidence level from the beginning, and even as David said, they still avoid it for a lot of reasons, not because they're bad doctors, because they're all amazing doctors that want to do the right thing. I think it's things that are in their way around patient flow and other things. So the simple answer is, yeah, it's a much deeper training to make sure they're confident in what they're doing, and then also working through the traditional stuff like workflow.
Right. So we're in our last 3 or 4 minutes here, and the question that I want to turn to is, this study is a little different. We weren't concerned with effectiveness or efficacy. Your tests all have a regulatory pathway. And the thing that we're really interested in is in a pre-competitive space where we're able to do an implementation science study and really look at what the barriers and facilitators are, both from policy and clinical practice and health system operations. What were some of the benefits you gleaned in taking a different approach to research in this way?
Really quickly for me is 3 things. It's don't underestimate the training and education you got to provide those clinicians. 2 is you got to build a champion, whether it's in a pharmacy or in a primary care office. And 3rd would be for me specifically in pharmacy, build a bridge to the MD, to the primary care office.
Great. That was succinct and a lot of good stuff in there. How about other folks?
I'm happy. Oh, go ahead, David.
That's tough to follow because it was so succinct and thought out. But I think the the thing that really benefited us is the need to focus on. I knew it was going to be a thing, but our mission at Lioness Health, and I believe everyone on this call, is to really bring brain health into its rightful place in the standard of care globally and make it accessible to everyone. And that requires a major thinking change in thought and even a behavioral change in the way we do things. It doesn't have to come outside the normal workflows, but just a recognition that, look, the brain is incredibly vital. All the biology rolls up into it. And it should be at every touch point in health. Should be considered at every touch point in healthcare. And so there's so many ways to assess it quickly, accurately, and it's just going to take a change of thinking. And I hope that's in the 21st century. I hope it's very soon, where we need that behavioral change. We need that change of thinking in the standard of care so that the brain is front and center, it's being assessed, and we can detect these things, these changes as soon as possible to really improve health outcomes and quality of life.
Great. And Joel, how about for you? What was the upside for doing a different approach, like an implementation science study in the pre-competitive space?
Yeah, I mean, at C2N, we have a lot of individuals from our team came from academia and have come from like the hard sciences, in the sense of thinking, well, we think of a molecular biomarker, so you have to develop the analytical capabilities of that assay. You have to then go on to validation. And there's really no, I saw one question in the Q&A about how many individuals is enough. There's really no limit to the number of individuals that you could study, because every one of these winds up being a learning experience, whether it's validation or implementation. And I think that we have gotten to the point, at least I can speak for our technology, where the accuracy of the test is not the issue. And it's actually the ability to implement it in clinical care. And I think that's why this initiative and the initiatives that are being planned with the next series of studies under Davos will be so critical, because it's not sufficient to simply say, oh, we have a great biomarker test that can now pathologically confirm the presence or absence of Alzheimer's disease. It's how do you actually simplify the flow of from the point that a patient or a caregiver feels that there's something abnormal that prompts them to go to primary care, who then has the ability and the feeling that there's going to be a system behind that clinician to then refer on to a more specialized maybe treatment capability through neurology or other memory care specialists, who will be able to provide patients with these disease modifying therapies and many other therapies on the horizon. So I think that implementation is so critical. And, I think we learned a tremendous amount from even some of the early successes we had from this study, but also the challenges. So.
Great. Thank you, Joel. So Brad, in the last 30 seconds or so, same question for you. What was the big learning from getting into real world settings and going through implementation?
So I think really simply, Tim, don't underestimate the demand of individuals to be able to understand their own brain health and to be able to measure that. And I think that, we talk about, the provision of agency to allow people to, assess themselves, and that, the demand that existed for sort of smartphone type applications, and the acceptance of physicians of that technology and of the validity of that, I think was a really important learning for us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for participating today. I really appreciate all your expertise. And I know over the last 2 years, you have walked very closely with us in our sites, fixing styluses, dealing with firmware updates, figuring out how to get pipettes into different countries, et cetera. So we really appreciate all your partnership and learning, and are really happy with how the programs are turning out. So it's my pleasure to turn the discussion today over to George Bradenberg, the founding chairman of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, and he's joined by several policy experts today who are going to talk about opportunities for expanding the policy landscape for early and timely detection interventions. So George, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks to all the speakers that we've heard from today. These discussions set us up very well for the challenges going forward of how to begin to scale the efforts that have occurred in our flagship and our grant programs in 19 countries in individual health systems. A couple of points that I just took away from the last speakers are both the availability and the quality of the tools that are now being developed. On the other side, the practical difficulties of overcoming both the consumer or patient, but consumer resistance and health system resistance. As we know from the Alzheimer's Disease International polling, over 60% of physicians and 60% of the population believe that Alzheimer's is simply a normal factor of aging and not a disease. So there's an enormous amount of sort of education is one word, but awareness that needs to occur over the course of the next couple of years to begin to increase the demand. And I think probably the approval of some disease-modifying drugs, even though they may not be applicable or practical to introduce in low-income settings, nevertheless is going to create some awareness that in fact this is more of a disease than it is a natural cause of aging. The other practical problem that we have is that we have been doing all of our testing by and large in high resource settings in white Caucasians. And we're beginning to learn that these tools and some of the blood tests may have differential effects and cutoffs in different racial populations. And that the genetics work that we have been doing in white Caucasians may or may not be applicable to the widely varying diverse populations in both genetics, biomarkers, and environmental settings around the world. So we have to be humble in terms of our ability to take the research that is so ably being driven by ADDF and by the Gates Foundation and actually assume that immediately these innovations are going to be widely adopted and that they're immediately applicable to quite diverse populations around the world. So that is one of the great challenges that I think we all have and that the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative is seeking to address. So let's move to the four experts that I'm privileged to have on this panel. And the goal here is to take what is being learned in these flagship and grant programs that you've had identified by the prior panelists and say, how can we move that to a policy levels where national governments begin to pick this up and drive the change that we're all seeking. And it's one thing to have some disease-modifying therapies, applicable or not applicable, but we always are going to have the ability through risk reduction techniques in the prevention space to take advantage of earlier detection and earlier diagnosis. So I'd like to have each of the four speakers introduce themselves. Maybe start with you, Hillary Evans. Would you please introduce yourself and where you're joining us from today and your role in your organization?
Hi, George. Thank you. Really wonderful to be here, and it's been great to listen to the previous panels. So I'm Hillary Evans. I'm Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Research UK. So I'm joining you from Cambridge, England. My other role and another hat is as the newly appointed UK Dementia Mission Chair. So that's really a government role and looking at how we can deliver treatments to patients and how we can pick up on a number of the conversations we've been having in the last hour, but use some of the unique things that I think the UK has to offer in this space, which I'll talk a little bit more about, into sort of a practical platform that we want to be able to work in partnership globally, but look at what we can do in the UK, given the political leadership that we've had here in dementia and want to carry on.
Thank you very much, Hillary, for your leadership over the years and now increasingly at the national level. Simon Jaguna, Simon, introduce yourself and where you're from and what's your role.
Yeah, so thank you for the invitation. I'm Dr. Simon Juguna. I'm a psychiatrist by training. I'm the Director of Mental Health at the Ministry of Health, Kenya.
And Kozuki Wada-san.
Hi, my name is Kosuke Wada, Council for Dementia Policy in Japanese government from Ministry of Health. I'm in charge of making national strategy for dementia policy in Japan. Also hosted G7 Health Ministers Summit last month. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Wada-san. Christine? I think you're still on mute.
No?
No, okay, now I hear you. Go.
I'm from Armenia. I am chief organizer in public.
Oh, we just lost you. Nope, no, she can't hear you. Nope. Let's, Christine, we're going to try and fix your audio, but we're going to move to questions as Alyssa Kurzman, our spectacular organizer, is going to try and help you get back online. So first I'm going to ask Wada-san. If there's any place in the world where this Alzheimer's problem and the mode of prevention and treatment is essential, it's in Japan as the fastest aging population in the world. By 2025, it's estimated that 20% of the Japanese age 65 and older will have dementia. The new Orange Plan in Japan prioritizes early detection and risk reduction, which we've seen carried out through your collaboration with us at the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative and the Worldwide Fingers Study, JMINT. From your perspective, what's the current landscape of early detection throughout Japan? What lies ahead? How do you envision the role of digital technologies or blood-based technologies in facilitating and scaling the wide adoption of early detection and diagnosis nationally within Japan?
Thank you very much, George. Yes, as you said, we have many challenges because we have the most society in the world at the moment. And for a long time, we have a big problem for early detection because of the capacity of medical workers and the social care. So as you mentioned, the Orange Plan focused the early detection, but now we have a new strategy for dementia. They focus only for the inclusive society and medical workers and the capacities. We have a special team for initial phase dementia therapies. Collaboration with medical doctors and social care. They lead to the early detection to medical care or social care. And that's today's topic. We expect the coming new treatment or DMT. So we have to change our strategy into the new.
Thank you, Wada-san. But in the Orange Plan, which did have such significant focus on risk reduction, I'm curious as to whether or not the early detection of cognitive impairment is a useful effort to identify those who ought to engage in more aggressive risk reduction, risk reducing behaviors nationally within Japan.
Yes, risk reduction is very important, and simultaneously, making inclusive society is also important because if we have early detection, we have to make some medical care or social care. And also, I'd like to point out that digital technologies are a bit difficult for age society. So, and also that we have a problem about the language and the challenges between Japanese and English, but we need a new technology.
Your mention of England or the UK it brings me to Hillary. Hillary, you have mentioned the new national mission to tackle dementia, the Dame Barbara Windsor Dementia Mission, of which you're co-chair. How do you envision early detection policies and the use of technologies in clinical practice shaping the landscape of this issue in the UK?
Yeah, so I think essentially this is going to be absolutely key to the work that I'm doing in the mission. And the UK's dementia mission, for those of you who maybe aren't aware, is one of the life sciences missions across the UK government. So we have them in obesity, cancer, addiction, and cardiovascular disease. And essentially we have a remit to look in each of those areas around what is it we need to do to deliver for patients in those areas, but what can we do as the UK? So what is it that the UK has that we can sort of harness from a life science perspective, from an NHS perspective, that can really help us be able to deliver, and where can we then make recommendations to government on this? So I've just come out of a ministerial meeting where we have had support to really be quite bold in this space. And I think that what we want to do is to look at that sort of end-to-end piece. So actually, how do we bring through all of the brilliant science that's happening, the work around biomarkers, the work in the digital space, the work around clinical trials, which in the UK has been a real challenge, aren't where they need to be. They're not quick enough, they're not efficient, they're not innovative. And then how do we ensure that as the first generation of drugs come through, they then get to patients? And so what we want to do is align all of that and be quite ambitious about how we do that. So one of the things that I'm really keen to look at whether we can push is almost a national program where we are offering everyone, say at the age of 60, the ability to come forward for early detection tests, genetic screening, biomarkers, digital detection, and essentially at that point looking at then how you have conversations with people who might be at high risk in terms of getting the right sort of gold standard diagnosis and understanding who will benefit from new drugs coming through. But I think there is an opportunity for the UK to do this because of the clinical data that we hold in the UK, because of the National Health Service, because of some of the fantastic genetic studies that we've got here, and actually because we do have a relatively small but quite diverse population. So I think to George's point around the diversity in a lot of this work, there's some really interesting work that we can do, and we want to do this in collaboration that we can do across the UK. So in my role as co-chair, one of the recommendations essentially that I'm making is that we aim to get to this point. And I think then actually, as others have said in the last hour, there's been some fantastic insights, there's been some fantastic technologies that actually we know can work. So actually we need to then think about which of those we could bring in and which we can sort of pilot within the NHS or alongside it within the UK. And there have already been some DAC partnerships across the UK and Scotland where we've been looking at sort of early detection. But I think that for us, the technology and the ability to detect and diagnose earlier unlocks that piece around ensuring that the right patient gets the right drug at the right point.
You mentioned Scotland. That is one of the areas, obviously, the DAC has been working with in the health system preparedness issue, but also in clinical trials and in the public health and prevention space. I'm curious as to what you've learned at sort of the systems level and putting all this together from the work that's been going on or anticipated to be going on in Scotland.
Sure, yeah. So I think the rollout from the kind of pilot in Scotland, I think, has been really interesting. And I think from, as any of these things, the learnings that will be for sort of whether it's the rest of the UK or how we can do this in other health systems around the world are around sort of where the blockers are, so who the sort of gatekeepers are, where the decisions are made. So I think some of the feedback from the sort of practicalities of how we do some of this have been really interesting. And a lot of this is about, I guess, using kind of technology and early detection and diagnosis as a way of driving through a new clinical pathway in dementia. In the UK, it's not it's not a pathway that exists, and we've had some really interesting conversations that those have gone before us in other disease areas. But what does that need to look like, and what are some of the learnings that we can take, particularly from the pilot in Scotland, where you've got sort of smaller populations. So I think a lot of these have been kind of practical learnings, which we're sort of feeding into some of the work of the mission. But I think that Scotland, is probably sort of ahead of the game somewhat in terms of being a really interesting sort of digitally forward thinking country. And so, I think we're keen to sort of learn from that pilot and what that can look like and what those learnings are. So I think we've got some of that initial data. But there's been, as with all these things, the sort of setup and how we do that takes time. But I think there's certainly some really useful evidence around sort of the digital tools that have worked really well there and what they look like. I think some of the challenges have been around some of the blood tests and some of the logistics in terms of getting the blood test and getting them sent back to the States, but actually looking at what we need to be able to do in terms of infrastructure in the UK and how that can sit alongside our clinical communities and a National Health Service that in the UK is under immense strain. For me, it's that sort of new way of doing something. And I think that's probably where we need to get to. So some of the learnings of trying to fit this into a current system, which is a bit clunky, actually, can we start with a sort of new system and a new thinking to enable some of those blockers to sort of be undone?
It's all very exciting what you're doing in the UK. You clearly have an enormous number of assets, and with NHS, you have the capacity to really drive scale and experimentation and scale in implementation. So we look forward to working with you and the Dementia Mission in the coming year and years to really use the assets that the UK has to really drive experience here in diverse populations. So I'm going to turn now to Simon Njuguna. In Kenya, the aging population is expected to double over the next 3 decades. We know that Kenya has been making great progress in developing national policies and prioritizing early detection. So this progress is evident through your partnership with the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. So I'd like to see how you anticipate your new national dementia plan in Kenya to address early detection and support the implementation of technologies for early detection and diagnosis in clinical practice.
Yeah, so thank you, George. As you have mentioned, we are very keen to developing our national plan on dementia. And we look at this from 2 strategies in terms of early detection, and then getting people to have a definitive diagnosis, and they can access the new therapies, and also doing the definitive diagnosis using the digital technology. But for people to access to this new technology, we need first to make the community much aware. And so we're having a lot of focus at the community level. And we have to aim at the community level is to ensure that we have the awareness and we have communities which are dementia friendly. And doing this, then we'll be able to train the community volunteers or the community promoters who are working within the community to be able to conduct cognitive tests, so that this is a screening process. But then once you do the screening for those people with various cognitive impairment, you need to get them to care. And here is where we'll have to develop the systems to ensure we're having up-to-date system in terms of diagnostic provision and access to therapy. And also we have trained human resource to be able to provide the care and to carry out this diagnostic therapy. So, but for now, in terms of resource gaps, we'll focus much on screening at the community level, creating community-friendly to dementia, and be able to have these people access the care. But I think that has been much informed by some of the studies we have done in one of our region, working together with DAC. We were able to conduct integration and evaluation screening tests in the community. And by conducting some of the results, some of the early findings from that research was using non-skilled health workers or non-skilled human resource. They're able to conduct the cognitive test. And by that fact, they're making the community aware and getting more and more people presenting to the hospital for diagnosis.
Let me ask each of you, if you could, fairly quickly, respond to a question in the chat, which is, how do we incentivize governments to actually take this on with some greater urgency and with greater scale and resource, so that in fact we gain faster ramping up of the use of these technologies, either for prevention work and risk reduction work, for trials, or for changes in our health systems. So let me just start with let's start with Hillary.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of things here. I think this is where charities and not-for-profits and patient groups have a huge role to play in holding governments to account in terms of campaigning, in terms of showing that we're giving the people living with this condition a voice and to be able to champion what it is that they need from all of us. I think when it comes to sort of political will for health economic data and arguments that we continue to generate and use, and the statistics in terms of the wider cost to our societies and the human costs and the pure economic cost of looking after people with this condition are obviously incredibly helpful. And in many of the countries that we are speaking from, and in the UK, the leading cause of death costs of over 26 billion, more than cancer, heart disease and stroke combined in the UK. So making sure that our regulators understand some of these arguments as well. And obviously in the UK, we have NICE in terms of approving the cost effectiveness of treatments, but also in terms of the challenges that it causes our health systems and the complexities of that. We know that 25% of beds in NHS hospitals in the UK at the moment have got someone with dementia in that hospital bed. So those sorts of arguments, I think, are really, really clear. I do think that the global piece is important. Obviously, we've played a role in the last 10 years at various G7s alongside a number of you, and working with other countries who are leading this space in terms of coming together and sharing that information and ensuring that our political leaders are working together and collaborating, because this isn't a problem that sits with any one of our countries. And I think that by coming together and encouraging our political leaders to sign up and continue to work in collaboration, I think is really important as well.
Wada-san, I'm going to put this question to you in the context of the G7. Japan has been a leader in this space for so many years, and yet we can't get to the G7 really to find ways to collaborate around these issues. What is your advice to all of us to not only take this to national governments, but to get international cooperation in this regard?
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe that this is the first time that the G7 health ministers mentioned about biomarkers for non-Alzheimer's disease. I believe that this is the most important part that we, in the coming new DMT eras, we have to collaborate much more about early detection and biomarkers and non-Alzheimer's disease research. Personally, I already have an agreement with the UK government about the dementia research. So this is the first one way to push this movement to the next stage. But I have to say that the government is not first. We have a need and to get some budget. But I believe that this collaboration is quite important to push this research to the next year. Thank you.
Simon, let me ask you the question in the context of Africa. Kenya is, I think, a leading edge country now in trying to drive these issues inside Kenya. Is there any opportunity for Africa to be taking a lead here, given its younger age demographics, to be able to detect cognitive impairment through the life course and drive research in Africa from a different dimension and with a different demographic focus. I'm curious as to whether there's an Africa for Africa research effort or implementation effort that might be pursued.
Yeah, so thank you, George. Yeah, as you have mentioned, in Africa, we're having, in terms of demographic, we're having a young population. And what is in terms of the African solutions, we have to address some of these issues. Yeah, so what we can say is in terms of research, there's so much focus in trying to understand some of the risks which could be very unique to this part of the world and how we can address the issues of risk reduction. There's also the issue of what awareness and early screening, the kind of impact it can have in terms of getting people to have early detection and treatment and care. But when it comes to advancement of new therapies and other kind of biomarkers, we think we need to collaborate across the world, because if we do research in some parts of the world and we are not collaborating, we need to have multi-centers research initiatives, because we need to understand from the different population, the population in Europe, Asia, America, and in Africa, and see what are things which are in common, and we can learn from each other. So from Africa, we wish to have this kind of global collaborations, trying to have this kind of research in terms of biomarkers, but then also ensuring that we have access to the new therapies across the world, that we don't leave anyone behind. That there are therapies in Africa as there are therapies in Europe and Asia. So to us, we think a lot of partnership and collaboration, but then also we look at the digital technology. It's spreading as quickly as it's spreading in other parts of the world with the globalization. So we want to have that opportunity working within the digital space to enhance research in Africa and also in terms of early detection.
I think we are about to wrap up. So I want to thank all of you on this panel for your efforts in your respective health systems, your respective governments, and indeed to bring global collaboration to this effort. You really summed up, Simon, very well the value of this learning lab, which is for all of us to learn from each other as rapidly as we can, because if we deal with this as an individual company, country, system, we're going to move more slowly than we would if we all can work together. It is, if you want to move quickly, you need to work together, right? It's an African saying, which I just blew to heck. So let me just quickly summarize this with thanks to all of the panelists here today and all the moderators, Phyllis and Tim for your leadership in this space, Drew for your leadership overall on the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. But let's just summarize. We have a disease that is affecting well over 50 million people. And indeed, if you add family members and friends, you're probably talking about 500 million people around the world. And we know that this disease starts 10 to 20 years before symptoms, that if in fact we can get increasing rates of detection and diagnosis early, whether it's for therapeutic interventions or more likely in the short term for risk reduction strategies, we're going to be able to do and make an impact on this disease much more broadly and at scale than if we work alone and if we don't detect early. So part of this is just what Phyllis mentioned as the two translational gaps. The translation, obviously, from research into therapies, but the translation of therapies and risk reduction theories into clinical practice. So that latter problem is obviously what we used to call in the media industry the last mile problem. How do we actually get these interventions, prevention or therapies into populations and treat the disease as we are increasingly know how it works in earlier populations pre-symptomatically. So problems around the world are common. Solutions ought to be shared and scaled, and we move more rapidly. So we've heard from around the world. We have 19 projects in 19 countries now. We have 19 projects in 19 countries. So we want to learn more rapidly through the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative Learning Lab. Thank everyone who's participated today. Thank all the listeners and viewers on this. And for those that have put questions inside the Q&A that we have not responded to on the fly, we will answer them with a variety of people that have been on the experts on our panels. So I call on every one of you who are online and who've listened today to identify what you can do locally or nationally or with us. So if you have additional thoughts or ideas on what we might do and with whom we might partner to bring a faster effort to prevent this disease globally, please let us know through Alyssa Kurzman or any one of us. So I look forward to working with everyone on this line and all the experts we've had today on a solution to this problem. And I look forward to seeing all of you at our next Learning Lab in mid-November. So thank you all very much for attending today. Thank you all for participating in the panels today and bringing so much insight and practical insight into their work. Have a good day, and let's go get this damn Alzheimer's disease knocked off. Take care.